How do we save Israel from itself? Does Joe Biden call up Bibi Netanyahu and say you can't do this? Does Secretary of Defense Austin say to Defense Minister Gallant, "We're going home because we think you're shooting yourself in the foot"?
Well, the issue is this. You have, on the one hand, an understandable and entirely justified interest on the part of Israel to destroy Hamas. I don't know of anybody who disagrees with that. I certainly don't. I'm 100% behind whatever can be done to destroy Hamas.
The only person that apparently disagrees with that is President Erdogan, who thinks they're a liberation organization.
Well, a couple of days ago, he took a different position. Now suddenly they become holy warriors defending their ground, which I think is very scary, because that makes it very clear that he has unambiguously aligned himself now with the opponents of Israel. He had not done that before. But I think it takes a president who has the authority and the strength to tell the Israeli government, no, you cannot go into Gaza and execute the plans that you currently have. Now, we've had this before. Richard Nixon made it abundantly clear that we would not tolerate an Israeli presence on the Egyptian side of the Suez Canal. Some of you may remember that the Israelis crossed that canal and then were withdrawn back to the other side. It eventually produced a very good agreement between Egypt and Israel. And of course, right, that's another concern. Why would you want to put that at risk right now? The Egyptians have tried very hard to work with Israel. In fact, we know that the Egyptian general in military intelligence alerted the Israelis to the possibility of this Hamas attack. At least that's the public record says that. So that's another problem. If you've got a population that's enraged, and that's the case all over the Muslim world right now, certainly in Egypt, how do you, General Sisi, who's leading Egypt, suppress the tendency to say we must defend and protect our brothers in Gaza? Egypt doesn't want a war with Israel, but how do you keep them out under the circumstances? I think it's the same thing for Jordan. I mean, the king of Jordan has done the same thing, tried to cultivate a good and positive relationship with Israel. But they all say the same thing. Collective punishment does not equate to Israeli security. It destroys it. That's the problem. So you've got to have a president that calls up and simply says, we can't do that. If you insist upon this, we will withdraw our naval forces. You are on your own. On the other hand, if you pull back, we'll reconsider what our options are, what can be done, then we'll remain and continue to support you. That's a tough thing for him to do, given the power and influence that the Israelis have in Washington, D.C.
Can the United States save Israel from itself, from the damage that it's doing to itself and to the region by the slaughter of innocent Palestinian civilians?
Oh, I don't know, Judge. I mean, look, in a sense, yeah, a good friend tells his buddy that, listen, you're drinking too much. You gotta, there comes a time where a little bit of tough love could come in handy. And I strongly believe that if you are a partisan, if one is a partisan of Israel and truly cares for the longevity of the Jewish state as conceived by its founders, then you ought to be against the Likud. You ought to be able to see how the nationalist right wing, whether the religious right or not, but the nationalist right, including the religious right in Israel, they are driving the country into the ground. They're making the whole project untenable by biting off too much land and too many occupied people for them to be able to take on. They can't give them citizenship. They can't expel them, but they refuse to let them have their own independent state. So they just have millions of captives who they treat like absolute, I won't say slaves because they don't want them, but they treat them as rightsless prisoners, essentially. And so there are, going back, in fact, the first prime minister of Israel, the famous David Ben-Gurion, after 1967, he said, we ought to give up the West Bank right now. We don't want to keep the West Bank and all these people that we don't want from their point of view. They have an 80-20 super duper Jewish majority over the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So what sense does it make to essentially kidnap millions more Palestinians that they don't want, that they would rather exclude? And
Well-
to Ben Gurion, it wasn't worth it to keep the West Bank. But to the Likud, it is worth it if they can keep the West Bank, and they'll just have to figure out something with the Palestinians later, which I think, back to your original question here, is essentially, I don't know if it's a path to total destruction of Israel, but it's certainly a destructive path when they could have just gotten along. They could have given up a Palestinian state years ago and figured out a much better way forward.
Can the United States either get Prime Minister Netanyahu to dial it back, call a ceasefire, exchange the hostages for the Palestinian prisoners that they have, and work something out? Or can the United States, by other means, save Israel from itself?
The United States can do it, but not by itself. The United States can do it in conjunction with actually the Arab League, with Erdogan and Turkey, with a broader world community. The United States is essentially almost isolated in the world, as we can see watching day by day in the United Nations deliberations. So in the United Nations Security Council, there have been several resolutions now, and the United States is essentially the lone voice against even a humanitarian ceasefire, much less a more general ceasefire. A humanitarian ceasefire means stopping the fighting to allow for humanitarian relief. There are calls, of course, for a general ceasefire, but even for a humanitarian ceasefire, the United States has stood essentially alone.
What conceivable argument could the Biden administration make for opposing a humanitarian ceasefire when at the same time he's calling for humanitarian aid?
The basic point that is hammered into every politician's head in Washington for decades is never show any space between the United States and Israel. And every politician is on a rote pattern to believe that. And every political advisor emphasizes, don't ever raise a question mark, don't ever raise a moment of hesitation. You will be attacked. You will be attacked by large Jewish donors. You will be attacked by Christian fundamentalist donors. You will be attacked by interest groups. You will be attacked by the Israeli government. It's a basic standard of American mainstream political life not to show any space between the United States and any Israeli government. So it's not that they love what's going on. It's that the politicians are trained, absolutely trained by habit, trained by circumstance, trained by experience, trained by their advisors. Don't question anything that Israel is doing. Of course, it's terrible for the United States. Absolutely terrible. You have to think in this world. You can't just be on rote and expect that things can work out, especially when you're in a deep crisis. That's actually the main role of a president of the United States, is to not have us slip into disasters. And right now, we don't have leadership. We have our spokesman doing the normal politics, which is Israel has no red lines, and it's led by Netanyahu. And when you tell Netanyahu no red lines, oh my God, because even if you told him red lines, it might not matter the first 10 times he hears it.